Hi there and welcome back to Honeydale Farm. My name's Paul from Cotswold Seeds, and for those of you who haven't seen the previous videos, we've been documenting our progress on installing beehives up at Honeydale Farm in the North Cotswolds. Now, as I say, in the previous videos, we were constructing the hives and we were painting them up in our chosen white colour. But that's just the exterior of the hives, and now we've put them in situ, it's now time to show you the interior components of the hives and show you how they were made and what they're being used for. So first of all, what I'm going to do is deconstruct the hive, the outside walls, so that I can start installing the inner components. Okay, so the internal components of the hive basically starts off with this, and what we call this is the brood box. Now, this is the largest internal component of the hive, and it contains the frames on which the queen will live, and she will bring up her brood of the next generation of bees. So this is the first part to be installed directly onto the base of the hive. So it just sits there, here you go. Simple as that. Now, inside this brood box, I mentioned the frames. Now these frames, these are the largest frames in the hive, and it's on these frames that the queen will lay her larvae, which will turn obviously into honeybees, and also it's where the honeybees will build their comb into which the larvae will be laid. Now you'll notice here that you've got what looks like a pre-formed hexagonal foundation onto which the honeybees will build their comb. Now you'll notice it's pre-formed, and that basically just gives them a bit of a head start. It gives them a foundation on which to start building the honeycomb. Now as you see, they're pretty simple structures, just made of very light softwood. When these are full of honeycomb and honey, ultimately they will be very, very heavy. So they need to be constructed quite carefully, and they're constructed by being nailed together. There's about 11 nails in each hive, in each frame. And you'll notice here that within the foundation there is a very fine metal wire. And this fine metal wire is to add structure to the frame when the honey is being extracted in a centrifuge. So normally when you've got a lot of hives, or if you've got a lot of frames to extract honey from, you'll put them in a centrifuge and they'll be spun. And if it's not a solid foundation, then you can damage this wax foundation quite easily. So then these brood box frames, as they're called, are dropped into the brood box, and they're equally spaced. Now the spacing between these frames within the box is quite important. As some of you may or may not know, bees are quite very, very clever insects, and they will understand the distance and the different gaps that exist within the hive. And if a gap is beyond a certain size, they will fill it, and they'll either fill it with honeycomb or propolis. So we have to be very careful about how we space these frames within the hive, so that it's the ideal distance, everything is within an ideal tolerance, so that the right activities can take place in the right parts of the hive. So that's the brood box and the brood box frames. The next to go onto here is the smaller super boxes, so I'll just go and grab one of those now. Okay, so beekeepers call this part of the hive a super. Now this is ever so slightly smaller than the brood box, and the reason being, well, I'll explain the reason in a minute, but more importantly first is this item here. Now this is what we call a queen excluder. Now what we've got is a rolled metal gauze, if you like, which is a very specific size. Now you remember me saying a moment ago that everything within a hive is a very specific size, shape. We have very specific tolerances within the hive, and this is one of them. And the tolerance here is to do with the size of the queen bee. Now these spacings here are just the right size to prevent the queen from getting out of the brood box. So the queen lives in the brood box, and that's where all the rearing of the larvae goes on. But we don't want the queen to go anywhere else in the hive. But the spacings here will allow all of the worker bees to exit up through the hive and get to the super boxes. So first of all, we place this queen excluder onto the brood box. All it does is just sit on the top there, and then on top of that we put the super box. Now, as I said before, the super is smaller than the brood box, and the reason being is because the super is the area from which we take our honey. So the brood box is filled first of all, and that is filled with the reserves that the bees need to last the winter. However, the supers, they will contain the honey that we extract as humans. This is the surplus that the honeybees produce. So for that reason, these frames are slightly smaller. They're not quite as deep. They're a little bit shallower, but they have the very same construction as the brood box frames. So as you see, they're all nailed together. Again, it's a relatively soft, light wood that's used to nail them all together. And we have that same wax foundation and the same wires which provide the support for the foundation. So then these are dropped into the super box, and again the spacings between these super frames are very important. Again, they need to be evenly spaced, and the bigger the spaces, the more honeycomb will be laid down on each of the frame foundations. If we put more supers in this box, the frames will be closer to, if we put more super frames in this box, the frames will be closer together, the honeycomb will be smaller, and this can help when you are either trying to produce honey on the comb or honey which you would extract to put into a jar. So generally, if you want honey on the comb, you would move the super frames further apart so that there would be more honey on the comb, more comb on the frames. So in addition to this, we now put another super, and that's just an additional storage area for more honey that we can harvest. So you have one brood box and two supers. I'm just going to go and get the last super now. Okay, so now it's time to install the final super. And before we do that though, we're just going to start reconstructing the outside of the hive at the same time. As you might have noticed, you build the hive up from the bottom, and you do that at the same time with the internal components as the external components. So let's pop down. Now we can put on the final super. Okay, so as I said before, probably when we first start with the bees, we probably won't have this final super installed, but just for demonstration purposes, we'll put it on today. Now, after the final super is installed, the next thing you want is what's called a crown board, and this is effectively like a lid to the internal components of the hive, and that just sits literally on the top of the hive there and just acts as a cap. Onto that we'll put the final lift. And finally, we can install the roof. Now the roof here you'll see is made of a metal surface, and basically, I mean, I can feel the heat on that already. So it's a reflective surface in order to try and reflect as much heat as possible, and that's why we've painted the hives white, to try and make sure that you know, we try and keep the bees as cool as we can in the very hot weather as it is here today. So that's the internal items of the hive described. Apologies for any experts out there, because I'm far from an expert, I'm purely a beginner. So apologies if I got anything wrong, but I'm sure I'll learn very, very quickly over the coming months. We're expecting the bees in the next week or two, so our local beekeeper, Chris Wells, will be dropping me a phone call and letting me know when they're ready. And then in the next video, we'll show you the installation of the bees and the final stage in the process of getting bees on Honeydale Farm.